Time to bring in our political panel, and joining us right here in the studio today, Labor MP Michelle Ananda-Rajah. Welcome back, Michelle, and Liberal MP Keith Wallahan. Same to you, Keith. Now, yes, there has been a sort of a charged atmosphere around the country, around the world with this Israel-Gaza war. Michelle, the Prime Minister told caucus today unity and harmony are needed in this country in the face of ongoing violence. That does seem a worthy, but in many ways lofty goal at the moment, doesn't it? Because war is, brutal by nature. We can expect many more protests and clashes before this is done, can't we?
Greg, the Prime Minister was speaking to the importance of social cohesion in our community. I'm seeing a disturbing level of polarisation emerge around this conflict, and we seem to have become incapable of inhabiting that space between those polarities. And it's within that space that you find compassion and you find curiosity. And that's what we really need to lean into. Now, to be honest, Australia has a limited role in influencing the events overseas. We work through multilateral diplomatic channels, and that is going on 24/7. But where we do have influence is here on our own soil. And we are compelled to look after each other, to support each other, to be compassionate towards each other during this time. Because as you know, this war may be more protracted than we think. There may be more suffering to come before things eventually do get better. I would urge everyone to support each other and to listen to each other and dial down some of that polarity and extremist views.
Yeah, that was probably the point of my question to Michelle. Keith, the idea that passions are going to be inflamed here on both sides until such time as the hostilities cease. Is it in your mind a question of not having gatherings of the sort that were held in Melbourne last weekend, or in having more tools to control them and diffuse the tension?
I think certainly that particular gathering in Caulfield was really one of the low points of freedom of association that I've seen in my lifetime, certainly in Australia. And I think that's got bipartisan commentary on that. That wasn't Melbourne at its best. And I really feel for the community there in Caulfield that was brought in to their neighbourhood like it was. I think the nuance gets lost here, and it's easy to frame people as cartoon villains. I've lost count of the times that I've been accused of enabling genocide because of the bipartisan motion that we had after the 7th of October. And I urge anyone who uses language like that, and some of the people who've used it, senior positions in universities, senior positions in corporate Australia, and they're blasting that stuff all over LinkedIn. And without, we didn't all turn into monsters overnight on both sides, but that's the way this debate has been framed.
Are there any powers that you think are needed to control gatherings like that? Do you think there'll be more of them, move-on powers required in this area, Michelle?
Good question. We, as you know, live in a liberal democracy, like other countries, including Israel, where you have a right to free assembly and free speech. And I think that is important. It's an important counterbalance to executive power. However, it's not carte blanche. We want to ensure that when people do gather to protest, that it's done in a peaceful, respectful way. I would say to everyone, we have got the memo. Your leaders are listening. We hear it loud and clear that you want this conflict to end, that you want the suffering of all people, including Israeli Jews, Israeli Arabs, the foreign nationals, the hostages to be released, and of course, the civilians in Gaza who are paying a grave price for the heinous attacks of this terrorist ideology and group. You want this conflict to end, but don't take it out in Australia. If you are going to gather and protest, do it in a respectful fashion.
Is that also a message, just to interrupt Michelle, is that also a message to those who demand ceasefires immediately? Are you calling for them to lower their expectations in that area? Or another way of putting it, do you yourself support calls for a ceasefire?
Well, look, there is this unfolding tragedy. It is linked to an intergenerational trauma, and we have to now think about how we go from this hell of war to the ultimate mission, which is an enduring peace. And in between that is going to be a ceasefire. There has to be. Now, we have said, though, that is contingent on a two-sided negotiated outcome, and it means releasing the hostages. It also means dismantling Hamas, this terrorist organization. Why? Because Hamas is incompatible with the existence of Israel. Israel is facing genuinely an existential threat during this conflict. Yeah. There's a possibility of a regional conflagration, and in addition to that, we have Palestinians who are suffering. And what is incompatible with both is Hamas and a terrorist ideology. So that must be dismantled, and we do support that. But we also say that sandwiched in between war and peace is a ceasefire.
Yep, no, they're highly conditional points. Did you happen to believe, Keith Wallahan, and you're listening to Penny Wong and her broaching the topic of what was, I think, a call conditionally for steps towards a potential ceasefire? Did you happen to believe that she was calling for one? Some people do.
Yeah, I'm not going to engage in commentary on word-by-word analysis of the Foreign Minister, but on the topic of the ceasefire, it goes to the right of Israel to defend itself and the right to exist. And I commend Michelle for linking any calls for a ceasefire with the destruction of Hamas and the return of hostages. Any call for a ceasefire that doesn't include those two conditions is disingenuous. Israel has to eliminate Hamas, and it has to have the return of the hostages. And I would like to think that's not just an Israeli cause, that should be a Palestinian cause too. And if they were protesting for that on the streets of Melbourne, how powerful would that be?
All right, well, since we're talking about protests, and Michelle has foreshadowed the likelihood that there would be more. In fact, there are students organising for some sort of strike. It's under the banner of Free Palestine Melbourne. It's proposed to occur on Thursday of next week, starting around lunchtime, but also spilling into school time. Should that be sanctioned by school principals in Victoria? We understand that a small number of public school principals have.
Absolutely not. I believe in free speech and freedom of association, but there's a reason we have the right to vote at 18. There's a reason 18 is the age in which you can join the military. You're a student and you're there to learn, to read, to write, and of course you can discuss and should discuss the world that we live in. But to encourage student activism where they're leaving school to go to protests that have already been shown to be unsafe, that's just, principals owe a duty of care to their students, and I think if they're sanctioning that, they're breaching their duty of care.
All right, Michelle, it's an important time of year with exams for many students. Should any of that learning time be sacrificed for extracurricular protests?
We don't need to make polarisation worse in this country. We've seen what it's already doing to our communities, both here and overseas. I'd circle back to what I said earlier. We need to lean into compassion and curiosity. And you know where the best place to learn compassion and curiosity is? It's in your classroom. It's in your classroom and in your schoolyard, where you're mixing and talking to kids of all perspectives, noting that these children often have a lot of lived experience themselves. Many of these kids have directly been impacted by the events of overseas. They need to sit down and talk to each other. They need to pore over the history books to actually understand the history behind this conflict and listen to their teachers. I would urge them all to stay off the streets and stay in the classroom. They're going to. I need our children of today to show us a better way.
All right. Well, that's a point that I think was made by Jason Clare and the Victorian Premier today. Moving on away from matters in the Middle East, Michelle, I'll put this one to you first of all. The High Court's decision on indefinite detention not being, legally permitted in the immigration system any longer. Are people entitled to know exactly how public safety is being preserved under these visa control regimes that have been put in place? It's a little opaque in what we've got so far.
Well, firstly, I understand that the community is concerned about their safety. This decision was made by the full bench of the High Court, and we resisted it, we argued against it, we are disappointed by it, but we accept it because we live in a country which respects the rule of law. With respect to the detainees who will now be released into the community, we have stood up what is called Operation Aegis. This will be an operation run by Border Force, including the AFP, with a plethora of state agencies, and it has pretty stringent post-offending controls
They're
imposed on
state
these
controls,
people.
are they? I saw that statement.
Right, state and federal to some degree. So it's a collaboration. For example, these detainees, once they're released, will have to report daily. They will be case managed on an individual basis. They will have restrictions on employment, where they can go and can't go, and they will even have their social media monitored, and they will have to report on that. So these are unprecedented. This is an unprecedented event, but we are putting in place safeguards to protect the community.
Definitely an example of governing in real time, as they say. I don't know if you've got to go. We'll persist with one question. No, you do have to go. Keith Wallahan, I wanted to throw that one over to you. I won't get the chance. I believe both of you have to leave and make your way to the Reps Chamber. So Keith, Michelle, Ananda-Rajah, we'll let you go. The bells are ringing. Thank you. Feel free to walk in front of cameras. Do as you must, because that's the untidy nature. You drop things on the floor too. That happens. That's the untidy nature of broadcasting when the Parliament is sitting. So we'll say farewell there to Michelle and to Keith with many thanks.